Dan Perry, the former Europe, Africa, and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, with us once again. Dan, good to see you as always. We want to start in Israel, where, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu is hoping to force Hamas's hand by shutting off power. We've seen this happen before. What do you think will happen next?
Look, Hamas historically has not been particularly susceptible to pressure that basically makes the population suffer because they do not care about the population suffering. The electricity is relatively speaking, a more tolerable measure for Hamas and for the population. But if they really cut off water, as some in Israel are threatening, or if food starts to run out, although they do have several weeks, I think, in storehouses at present, then that might start to look different. This is not so much about coercing Hamas to give up the hostages, because Hamas has already agreed to give up the hostages in exchange for an end to the war, and Israel signed on to that deal. What's actually happening is that Israel, with the encouragement of Trump, is essentially walking away from those terms because it doesn't want Hamas to remain in power in Gaza, and the original deal doesn't address that issue. So on one hand, it's a violation of the agreement. On the other hand, it's in a pretty good cause, because the outcome of Hamas remaining in power in Gaza is terrible for everyone. And what really I think is happening behind closed doors, maybe under in some kind of subterranean fashion, is that the Israel, with the assistance of the U.S. and the West, is trying to pressure the Arab countries to do everything conceivable to coerce Hamas into not only giving up the hostages, which, as I say, they'll do, but in giving up power and handing the keys over to someone else, perhaps the Palestinian Authority, maybe some multinational force of Emiratis and Saudis. That remains to be seen.
You mentioned the strong arming being done under, of course, the agreement with President Trump, forcing essentially, or at least insinuating, that he is fully behind Prime Minister Netanyahu changing the terms or being a little bit more forceful with Hamas. But wouldn't Israel say that it was Hamas who originally violated the terms of the original peace agreement? I remember that being talked about in these discussions.
You mean of the original truce agreement from 2 months ago? Yeah, they might say that, but that would be being economical with the truth. Hamas staged various stunts while releasing hostages that were offensive to a lot of people and to me, and amounted to psychological tactics to create depression and pressure on the Israeli public. But they did stick to the fundamental terms of how many people they released, who they released, according to the timeline that was agreed. The basic issue is that Israel was never really comfortable with a deal that left Hamas in power in Gaza. And indeed, Netanyahu faces the not implausible outcome of his coalition falling apart if he goes ahead with the deal.
It'll be interesting to see what actually forces Hamas's hand. Before we let you go, Dan, I've got to ask you about these proposed sanctions on Russia. What do you think is happening behind closed doors as President Trump and President Putin have these conversations, but on the outside, we're hearing about the Kremlin potentially facing more sanctions from the U.S.?
Yeah, look, Trump has been under so much pressure for having appeared to become a Putin puppet because of the way he's adopted Kremlin narratives in the past 2 or 3 weeks, that I wouldn't consider it impossible that much of this is basically for show. But there are still sanctions that can be implemented against Russia. Russia has not been fully kicked out of the SWIFT banking system. Russia's trade with the U.S. is down from about 30 billion a year to 3 billion. That's 90%. But there's still some trade that could be eliminated. U.S. could impose punitive measures on banks and companies doing business with Russia. So there's more to be done. But that said, we talk about Hamas being impervious to pressure, Putin even more so. I have difficulty seeing Putin giving up his basic war goals because the already stupendous economic sanctions have been ratcheted up somewhat. Most of the music that you hear, in fact, is pressure on Ukraine, much more than Putin. And the Europeans are really stunned about this. I was in Europe twice in the past several weeks, and I can tell you that the sense in Europe is that for the first time in 80 years since World War II, the U.S. is basically turning its back on a transatlantic alliance. Everything has become transactional, and values and principles no longer matter. And they're looking under every rock to figure out a plan to achieve military independence. It may not be so possible so quickly. It may not be possible for Europe to give Ukraine everything it needs if the U.S. fully pulls away, but they're going to try, because there is a sense that dependence on the U.S. under Trump essentially is a recipe for mistreatment.
We'll see. And I could talk to you for about an hour just about that topic alone. Dan Perry, thanks for joining us live here on NewsNation Now.
And I would do. Thank you.
Thank you.